us on to the next topic now. So developing clear requirements. There's another whole session track going on about requirements. So, this isn't really a conversation about like how to write a requirement,
Right.
the SMART acronym stuff, but I'd be interested in your thoughts about how do you make sure the vendors actually understand what the state needs, and how do you make sure that the state understands what the vendor really can provide? What issues have you seen there, and other techniques you've seen that have really worked?
So you're asking us to talk magic again?
Yeah. So, Kim, why don't you start first?
I think the magic is collaborative engagement with our vendor community and using the RFI process. But again, I'd recommend that we get either DGS or STPD involved in actually doing the RFI. So we're asking the right questions. Sometimes we put RFIs out there on the street to the vendor community, and you're not necessarily asking the right question. And so I think it's important. We do a lot of RFIs at OSI, and I don't always go through DGS or STPD now. So I was conducting my own, and so what I found out, or the lesson learned, is working with the program people and the questions that they're asking and trying to help them write their requirements. They have difficulty expressing their business requirements in a way that maybe the vendor community can understand what their business is. So I recommend that we get people who actually know how to write requirements to help program actually write clearly defined requirements, and then we can put those requirements out for the vendor community to ask questions. I think our new process that Marnell is implementing at STPD, where we're putting out the draft solicitation in the procurement process, is going to allow the collaborative discussion with the vendor community to provide us comments to help us develop a better RFP. So we put the draft out there and the vendor community doesn't understand half of it, then we can go through and work with them to have a final solicitation that we can put out on the street that both the customer department and the vendor community, as well as the procurement officials and the project people, can all understand what the solicitation says. So,
And the market research, I think, is really key. I mean, I just had to slow down a project and ask them to redo market research just last week. And it was basically because between the FSR and when we started the procurement, there was like 3 years, right? And so the industry for that type of application, what their business need was, which was kind of certification, testing, those kinds of, and then being able to put in who's been certified and all those kinds of things, has changed incredibly. I mean, much of the applications are sitting up in the cloud, right? And there's a lot of storage and a lot of, so that industry, or those solutions have exploded in the last couple years. So, unfortunately, even if you do a pretty good job of writing out your business requirements, you need to keep them fresh. And, when I get an RFP to review, and hopefully early on in the stage, before we're even in, think about the procurement process, we've got some business requirements. I start reviewing them, and they're telling me they want a COT system, but we've got, 3,000 requirements. I'm pretty much thinking we're not going to do a COT system and meet all those requirements. So, I mean, it's really important that what your business people are telling you, and then what your IT people are telling you, and then what the administrative people have done in the FSR, all match up, right? Because the outcome is still going to go back through all those agencies that somebody wrote and told them how exactly we were going to do this, and now we come up with this solution that has nothing to do with what we justified. So you have to your business requirements, your market research are really, really key. And you need to look at those and refine them throughout the time before you go to actually put the bid out on the street. Because you may have started them 5 years ago or 3 years ago, and in that time period, lots changes. Your business requirements might even change some, so.
And I want to add, after you've done your RFI, your draft solicitation, please plan on not just doing a one final proposal. Do drafts, because what's going to happen is you didn't build in that time for the draft proposal. You'll get final proposals. Nobody's compliant because they didn't understand requirements. And so you'd have to throw out all the bids. So you throw them out, declare it draft, and then you'll have your confidential discussions. I would, from the beginning, just plan on having a draft.
Yeah, because otherwise.
Submission that gives an opportunity for the bidders to look at it, to prepare their drafts. You have your confidential discussions to clarify. I mean, you can understand their proposal better. They can understand the state's needs better. Then they can go back and then submit a really good, hopefully, a really good final proposal
And
that
if you
can be
need another
evaluated.
confidential discussion, you can add one.
Yes.
I mean, look at the procurement process as a
Iterative.
process, and that you can, you might have to add a couple additional steps in there to come out successful. But that's what we want, is a successful contract at the end that we can then implement to. And then the whole contract management is a whole nother issue that we'll have to deal with.
Different discussion.
Okay, so a couple things. I look at that statement, how to make sure vendors understand the state's needs. I think even before we get to that point, the state needs to understand the state's needs. Do we understand our own requirements that we're putting in all our bids? And that takes time to do that because there's so many people involved, and technology it was once explained to me as a layered cake, that there's all these sections sitting on top of each other. So what sounds good to one, if they haven't checked with another area, maybe that requirement isn't good for that area and they need to tweak that a little bit. But I also think we're getting into I really like the idea of putting draft bids out. Draft solicitations with the...
It's not in the procurement process timeline.
Right.
It's before the procurement starts.
Right.
It's planning.
But Graeme, I might turn to you now and try and leverage some of your knowledge, because I think now we start talking about things that are, this is where we're building that relationship with the vendor. It's a two-way street, and I can't tell you how many vendors have signed up for things and then told me later, oh, no, we really don't do that. We don't meet that requirement. That's not part of our solution, but they've marked yes and told us how they're going to do it. I had one vendor tell me, oh, I'm sorry, I just didn't read that. I didn't notice that. And we're like, okay, but you signed up for it and you signed up for the contract. So I know, and depending on the size and the magnitude of the procurement, some of the bids or solicitations get split up, right? They go to different places. But from the vendor perspective, it's really, from the state perspective, it's really important to me that if we do release draft solicitations, or we do release a bid with time for questions and answers, or if we do have bidder conferences, that the vendors are also engaged with us and asking us those questions, and not waiting to the end to say, oh, no, your requirement didn't make sense to us. This is how we took it. So
And we know that sometimes there's a reason they're saying that, because they want to stall the process, because they're in the middle of answering a bid for somebody else, right? And they need a little more time.
Right, or the only other thing we can assume is, well, I'll just tell them, and then we'll get so deep in, and they'll change it later, they'll waive it, or we'll figure it out later. I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but can you shed any light on that?
Well, I mean, sure. I mean, assuming sort of a basic level of competence on behalf of the vendor, so they're actually going to read, at least the information. I mean, it does get split up, but usually there's a few things that happen. If it's listed as a mandatory requirement, then you're going to hit, well, of course I'm going to hit it, because I'll get thrown out if I don't do it. Whether I think I can do it or not, well, we'll figure that piece out, but I know I've got to say I can do it. Where I've seen a lot of the problems, because usually, I mean, my experience is, prior to working for Thornton, I worked for a couple of the big system integrators that we were bidding on the big jobs. And you do your best to really understand what you thought the government wanted, but where I really saw the issues were there was a set of words on a piece of, like the system shall, in an Excel spreadsheet, and you read a set of words, you went, well, yeah, okay, we do that, and you had a mental image in your mind of what that was. The person who'd written that on the government side, they'd written those words, and they had a mental image of what it meant, but turned out the two mental images weren't the same, and you never found that out until after you signed the contract, and is what I used to call the, oh, that's what you meant moment. But it was after you already had a signed contract. And so that's where I've found it very useful, is where the government has tried to sort of accelerate that, oh, that's what you meant, to before you get to the point of a signed contract. And, I sort of joke sometimes that maybe it's like English is just not a very good language.
German.
You
told me German was the best.
I think German's probably a better language, but we don't speak it.
Okay.
And so that's one of the things I wanted to get a sense from you as well is, generally the way you see requirements defined, the sort of a traditional way, especially for IT procurements, is an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of narrative statements like the system shall, and obviously there's some usefulness to that, but also English is just an ambiguous language. And so, do you address that by changing the way you express the requirements, or do you change it by changing the process so you allow more dialogue so you can get to that, oh, I didn't really understand what you meant by that?
So I think 6611 helps get us there. The most successful, I've done a lot of contracting, and I've actually been involved in projects and implementation. The one that I'm proudest of, but was one of the hardest things I've ever done, is a contract that we actually went through a bid, ended up with 4 bidders, worked with the top 2. The first one actually would not continue to want to negotiate statute that I couldn't negotiate, and they just didn't seem to understand why we couldn't negotiate. And then we got stuck on one statute provision, so we went to the second supplier, and we ended up sitting down in a room for a month writing the contract. And it was an incredible experience, but I have to tell you, we had roles, responsibilities, we had the number of PYs, at which point in the project they came in. Everything that the state was responsible for was there. We had classifications, skills, knowledge, abilities spelled out, and on the supplier side, with schedules with weeks rather than dates, so that if we did miss a milestone, then when we finished that milestone, we were back on the weeks, so we didn't have to keep changing the contract. It was just, and I have to say, it's been a very, very successful project, and it was a statewide project, and I just think that if you really want to get down to an understanding of the requirements, then you have to do that through negotiations. Otherwise, you're kind of waiting for IV&V and ITPOC and the supplier to burst your bubble, that they didn't know that that's what you meant, or IV&V to catch that the supplier wasn't actually doing all the requirements that are sit in the contract.
Or you come to the point where, I don't want to say you're fighting, but you're having major disagreements. You're having to go through dispute resolution, because technically, yeah, they did meet the requirement, but that was so not what we meant, and it's going to cause, the state to not be successful. We won't meet our outcomes. So, requirements can hinder you or they can help you, and it's just finding that balance and writing really good requirements.
And maybe the requirements with the outcome we expect, right? So that at least if there's not a meeting of the written word and as far as thou shalt, at least the outcome has to happen. Because isn't that really the key?
Yeah. One thing that I remember, I did some work supporting the fiscal procurement when they were going through the two-stage process. And one of the things that used to be talked about inside that was trying to take the stress off the requirements, that the requirements didn't have to be perfect, because you knew they weren't going to be perfect. You didn't know which ones were wrong, but you knew some of them would be wrong. And how can you change the process so you can get a decent result even if you've got imperfect requirements, because you know the requirements aren't perfect? And that's, I think, it gets the tools, I guess, again,
Right.
using all the tools so that the requirements aren't needed to be absolutely perfect to still get you a good contract. So does anybody have any sort of questions or sort of thoughts they want to share around, requirements and vendor understanding?
I have a
Yeah.
thought. And one is that when you write the requirements, when you write your statement of work, it's very important to think about the outcome that you want, the performance that you need, the performance standards. What is the measurement of success, and building acceptance criteria and those types of standards into your SAP, not just your technical requirements or your business requirements or your functional requirements, but also think about what are the state's responsibilities? What is the state providing? Because sometimes the vendor can come back and say, well, you didn't fulfill your end of the bargain. And therefore, how could we fulfill our end of the bargain?
And when you're doing that, think about how, because the things that you're talking about, or the elements that you're talking about, are contract management elements. Also assign pay points. How are they going to get paid for the delivery? So what are your deliverables, and how are you going to accept those deliverables and pay for them?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Another thing that helps, and I think it segues to one of our topics, is unanticipated tasks.
Oh, yeah.
Because no matter how well you've written your RFP and you've done your drafts, had your confidential discussions, the contractor gets in there and starts actually doing the work, and things get uncovered, especially, well, I know at EDD, we're working with a very old legacy system. And when the contractor gets in there and opens it up, it's like, oh my goodness, it's like the Winchester Mystery House. It's like, oh, it looks fine from the outside, but you get inside, it's kind of weird. So if you build in some unanticipated or a process for it, because you're bound to have, it's going to happen. It always does. And so if you build that in ahead of time, it will help alleviate to some degree cost overruns, NCBs, SPRs, and it gives you some wiggle room to change requirements, refine them a little better, maybe change them. Where state government rules change during the life of a project, new legislation comes in.
Or we don't realize we're
And-
supposed to have a red ribbon tied around the
Yeah.
basket of stuff that we send to controller's office.
Yeah, and
then
so-
we need to have a clear ribbon because
Yeah.
the
So
system won't do red.
That dealing with change topic was actually sort of, it was the very last thing we had on it.
Oh, okay.
We should probably just go, why don't we just go there right now?
Okay.
Because that was one of the things we wanted to talk about is, the sort of 10% unanticipated tasks thing is relatively normal, but if you're in a situation like the one that Sheri described, where you can imagine there's significant uncertainty, and maybe it's really hard to pin down the scope in advance. Is the traditional firm fixed price thing really going to work sort of out of the box? Have you had experience with larger contingency reserves? Maybe that, it's a bigger number than 10%, but how do you deal with that, and how do you get that through the finance and the legislative process as well?
At OSI on and again, I think I said earlier that the majority of our projects, or all of our projects, have federal dollars in there. So the contingency that we typically build in are for system changes. So yes, we have a 10% unanticipated new legislation, that kind of thing, but we also have a system change budget that could also help with the legislative changes. And so we have been successful in putting just a bucket dollar amount for system changes and justifying what kinds of things could actually be used. And again, this is contract management. What kinds of things can actually be used in that area? And we do work authorizations to the vendor community. And as you know, work authorization, maybe you don't know, but work authorizations are used, and those function as amendments to your contract, right? So, this is what your original contract was. You have a system change bucket. You have new legislation that comes in. in, and you do a work authorization to the vendor, and the vendor tells you what that's going to cost you. You agree on what those deliverables are, and you execute a work authorization, and you get started on the work. So, and you don't have to go through, do an NCB, do legislative, do an SPR. You don't have to go through and do those because the contract already has the dollars in it.
Another way to handle that is to have options, like there's some functionality you think you might want, but you're not sure. You want to see the system first and then maybe add it later, but you don't want to commit or encumber the money for it right now because you just don't know if you're going to need it or want it or whatever. But if you build that into your proposal, the bidder can bid on it, and it's written in as an option. If it's an option, you'll do an amendment and
Exercise your option.
exercise your option and add the money. So then you don't have to do an NCB. It's already been approved by everybody, that the control agencies that reviewed that RFP, and so that gives you another way to have some flexibility.
Ben, did you have You're good?
So I'd agree with everything they say, but the one thing I would really stress is I would encourage you to include that in the beginning of the procurement so that it's there from day one, because if you don't, my experience has been if you come later, and whether it's through an NCB or some other process, that's really an uphill battle because you've got to go to control agencies and explain to them what happened, and the questions you're going to get are, is the vendor not performing? Did you not plan well enough? It's this...
Oh, there'll be more than that.
Yeah.
40 that you get.
Yeah. So if you include it in the beginning and kind of set that parameter up front that, hey, this is a really complex thing we're working on, and I guess you could do it for things that are less complex too, and everybody understands from the get-go that there's going to be change in this project, rather than waiting and doing it midstream. Then everybody goes, well, is the vendor not performing, and why didn't you plan for this? And it creates a lot of worry and a lot of work that could be taken care of if we put that stuff up front.
Although we wouldn't want to be paying the vendor if they weren't performing on deliverables, but we do want the ability to be able to manipulate or change within a basic framework with certain specific outcomes that we're looking for, to be able to change around requirements. Because we all know in these big projects that take a year to 5 to implement, that, stuff happens. So we need, if we plan for it up front, then we're not having to turn back around in the back end and having to go out and get permission for something that everyone knows happens in these big projects. We're just planning for it.
So as Michael said, do it in the beginning, but it's not just in the procurement, it's in your FSR.
Right.
Or your approval documents to your federal partner, or even to DOF. You need to include this concept of change with maybe a dollar amount assigned to it, which is different than your unanticipated task. So this is a change bucket, if you will. So.
Does anybody have any questions or thoughts they want to share on this topic? Okay, let's move on to the
It
next.
sounds so easy when you say it, doesn't it?
I know.
And I have to tell you, getting that change bucket approved, Department of Finance frowns on it, our federal partner frowns on it, but
really
we have
important.
been successful in getting it. It does save a lot of time in the implementation of these large projects, so. Bless you.
Bless you.
What you're usually going to hear is that once you incorporate that money into the contract, it's spent. So what they're probably going to ask you to do is, okay, if you want to have money in your contract, you better show us a pretty robust process for how you're going to have control over this money, because we don't want you spending that money on their non-performance for things that you're already paying them for. So to get to that, of having a plan and putting that money in there, like everything else that we've talked about today, does take time and it does take work, but I think it's worth it.
Especially, and using, like she said, the optional thing. I know when I worked at DGS, we did that a lot. We had the optional cost sheets where if we ended up needing to bring in something else, and it was, either desirable or optional, and the requirements were spelled out there, that then we could bring that up from the cost sheets into the, through an amendment, and not have to, reevaluate or justify or whatever, so helped a lot.
So I'm going to move us on to the next topic.